Okay, today we're looking at the truth about Judgment Day. And this comes from a question one of our viewers sent in. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on the idea of Judgment Day. I have mixed feelings about it, and I would appreciate any light you might shed on the subject. And this is a subject that has been of interest to me for a long time, mainly because it was hard for me to reconcile the idea of a God of love casting people into the fires of hell and all that. If you go online and do a search, do an image search, and you will find a lot of very graphic, I think it's like religious pornography. It's just people burning in flames and, being cast into the eternal fires of hell and all of that. And so it's difficult to reconcile that, to think if God is love, surely there's a way out. Surely. And Jesus is the one that actually brings this up, and I want to just address that so you get a better perspective. I'm sure that most of you have worked this out in your own thinking, that you've come to many of the same conclusions that I've reached. I've done quite a bit of study on what scholars think, what critical scholars think about it. But you will go online, and I do this every week just to see whatever subject I'm talking about, to see what the mainstream thinking is, which I already know, but it's kind of interesting to just have it confirmed, to see they're still doing it, it's still there. And it's pretty dire. And it's based a lot on, there are several references concerning a judgment day. It's sometimes called the last days, the end of days, or the end times. In mainstream Christianity, it is the day of reckoning, summarized in passages like this one. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and throw them into the furnace of fire. There men will weep and gnash their teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Now, these words are attributed to Jesus. And it's interesting that he's referred to in the New Testament as the Son of Man. He's speaking almost in the third person, but we're to assume that it's he that will come back and lead this charge. And so, as I have raised the question, does this sound like something Jesus would say, or does this sound like something a Jewish mystic would say, or does it sound like something an evangelist would say? So we've got three choices, basically two choices, an evangelist or a Jewish mystic, which I think Jesus is, or was. So that's the question I always ask when I come across something like this. And for me, the red light goes on instantly. When I read something like this, Jesus would not say something like this. This would come from the evangelist, from the writer, the gospel writer, who was interested in getting people to think a certain way about Jesus. And as I have pointed out, there's an evolution from the actual teachings of Jesus to teachings about Jesus. And this is a teaching about Jesus, not something he's claiming for himself, although if you take it literally, as a lot of people do, you would see it that way. But we just have to employ some common sense. If you had kids, if you raised children and they did some bad things, could you ever imagine yourself casting them in eternal fires of hell? They may have put you through that, but can you imagine making a choice to put them through that? We have moments when I see a mother-daughter team there. moments when we might think about it, might cross our minds. But it's there's just something very appalling about that type of thought, that a loving God and Jesus, who represents that loving God, would come up with a message like this. But I could see the leadership of a church doing it. They did it with the Spanish Inquisition. They did it in all kinds of ways, where they would go into communities that where people would not profess Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, and they would execute them. Any that would not become believers. This was at first the Roman Empire, and then it became the Catholic Church. The Roman Empire would put people to death simply for being Christian, for being of this sect that they did not understand. At first, it was legal to be a Christian because it was considered a Jewish sect, a part of the Jewish religion, and the Jews were given a pass by the Romans. They were given the ability to worship in their own way. They did not have to go to the ceremonies that acknowledged, honored certain gods and Caesar or whatever. They did not have to participate in that. And so the Christians were under that umbrella. But when the Christian and Jewish communities began to separate, and they did this somewhere in the mid-100s, after one of the major wars that they had between the Jews and the Romans. The Christians started going their own way, and so the Romans started looking at them in a different way. They were no longer under the get out of hell free card. They no longer had that pass that the Jews enjoyed, though that there was struggle between them all. But the Romans started recognizing them as a sect that was not covered by the privileges that the Jews were. So they started saying, "Oh, you're a Christian, and we will give you the opportunity to denounce that." And one of the leaders said he would give them three chances to denounce that they were followers of this Nazarene. And if at the third time they didn't confess that they were not Christian, or say that they were not Christian, he would have them executed just based on the fact that they were called Christian. And people would often accuse their neighbor of being a Christian when maybe they were or they weren't. If they just got mad because they didn't return their rake or something like that, they would report them, and so they would have to defend themselves. Well, I can understand how an organization that can do things like this, and what the Romans were doing to the Christians started doing to themselves, to aspects of Christian sects that they did not approve of. And so the Inquisition would go around, and somebody would accuse somebody of something, and they would have to prove their innocence. And if they didn't do that, they'd be tortured or they'd be killed or whatever they would do. It was a horrific thing. So I could see an organization imposing the concept of a judgment day where people will be judged, thrown into the fires of hell eternally, and all of that. But I cannot see a genuine mystic. I cannot see a Jesus of Nazareth saying something like this, agreeing to something like this. So we have to read our Gospels from this perspective. Who wrote this? Jesus and the Gospel writers had two completely separate objectives. Jesus was teaching people about this inner kingdom, how to tap into it, and how it would make your life better if you learn to trust that loving light that is within all people. And if you let that light shine, and how it would help your life in a very practical way. If you found that inner peace, that sense that God is working in and with you, why do you worry about what you'll eat and what you'll drink and what you'll wear? Life is so much more than that. And I think the body of his teachings were referred to as the way. And this is the way. And the Taoist says the way is a natural flow of the universe. And if you are engaged, part of the way, if you put yourself in that flow, your life works. And if you're out of that flow, it doesn't. And it's based on the principle of oneness. I am one with God. And mainstream Christianity, and the person that's doing this speaking, is coming from the principle of separation. God is somewhere else, and we're here. And one of these days, God's going to return, and there's going to be a judgment. And if you have been doing evil and causing evil things to happen, you've got a problem. But you can resolve that now. So that's the message. Jesus said, the kingdom doesn't come through observation. You can tell these are the words of a mystic. We don't say it's low here, low there, because the kingdom of God is within. That's the whole heart of mysticism. The Father and I are one. Your Father and my Father. It's not just my Father. I'm not the only begotten Son. That's the teaching of the church. Son of God, the expression of God, the soul that we all are, is God in expression. And as we start understanding ourselves from this perspective, our life works better. We take a much larger perspective. And we're not into all this sin and punishment. And I've pointed out that the whole basis of mainstream Christianity requires sin. It requires sin to exist. If it didn't, salvation would not be needed, and we wouldn't need Jesus. We wouldn't need all the stuff that they talk about all the time. So as we think about this, think it through. If we're expressions of God, we're created in the image and after the likeness of God. Yes, we have problems, and problems arise because we forget. We have forgotten, we have lost sight of who we are at the spiritual level. And the great Redeemer, this great teacher that came along, did so to remind people. Take time to go into your inner room and shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. That is, your life will work better when you touch this center, the center of power. It's a message very unlike this. If you don't behave yourself, if you don't walk the straight and narrow, you're going to pay dearly. It's like there's two Jesuses. And the truth is there are many Jesuses. But there are basically two. There is Jesus, the mystic, and there's the Jesus of the church. Two different Jesuses. So that's what we have to learn to separate. We separate the sheep from the goats. You know, Jesus was always talking about pairs of opposites. The kinds of fish, the good fish that we keep, the bad fish that we throw away, the fish that we don't want, we throw away. The wheat and the chaff, sheep and goats. Rich man, poor man. There's always this balance, and it's this, if we understand it from the mystical perspective, he's talking about our two identities, one that is tuned into the soul, the spiritual image likeness of God that we are, and that personality that we have invented, that self-image that is body-based and very externally oriented, often in need of salvation. This is where the mainstream Christian philosophy comes from. It is based on the principle of separation. We are separate from God. where mysticism is based on the principle of oneness. We are already one with God, and we've forgotten. We have lost sight of that awareness. It's a very different approach to life. One, you start out guilty by birth. You were born in sin. And why is that? Because we go clear back to Adam and Eve. They've got all bases covered. Just because they did what they did, they disobeyed God, you are also guilty by association. You're a human being, so you were born in sin. And you're in need of salvation. And if you don't pick up the proper ticket, you're not going to get in. You're not going to be saved. But I prefer the message of the prodigal son that goes out and has a great time, does all the worst things imaginable, but comes home and is welcome. That's the kind of God that I believe in. And there's so many different ways we can look at that particular story, but to me, as I have said, that's Jesus' flagship parable. It says it all. That should be the outline for Christian thinking. And it becomes our outline, our thinking. We don't have to try to reconcile anything. So though these words are put on the lips of Jesus, this is a good example of one of the identifying themes of the early church. The Jewish mystic would not speak of a coming kingdom, but of one that is found within one's own being at this very moment. So that's something very important to think about. How to identify when the gospel writer, the evangelist, is speaking, when that person puts words into Jesus' mouth, or when Jesus probably was doing the speaking, and the evangelist uses the original lines that they came across. Mark was the first gospel written, and if you want to get a sense of the timeline that was presented, Mark is the one you should read to go into. I was also doing some research on how the writers would use Old Testament prophecy. They would use the Old Testament to prove their point that Jesus was the expected Messiah. And we start out right from the very beginning in Matthew, for example, declaring that, coming to Mary, saying that you'll conceive and bear this child, and she was a virgin and all that, and it refers back to a verse in Isaiah. But if you actually go back to that verse in Isaiah, you'll find it's not talking about Jesus at all. It's speaking of the time during the kingly reign of Ahab. And he had two other kings that hated his guts, and he hated theirs. And so the sign that they would be taken down, that they would be destroyed, would be a young woman, doesn't say a virgin, but a young woman will bear a child. Nobody knows who that is, but his name will be called Emmanuel. It was a prophecy that occurred back in about 735 BC, not during the time of Jesus. So the writers took great liberties, and you'll find that this is true over and over and over again. If you read, this was to fulfill the prophecy of or the words of the prophet when he said this or that. If you will go back, and most Bibles will give you the cross-reference where to go look at it. If you'll read the whole context, you will agree probably with most modern scholars that say none of these were prophetic. None of them were talking about Jesus. They were all used by the gospel writers to get their point across. So we have a message of Jesus, and we have a message about Jesus. And it's very important that we're able to distinguish that, because we don't want to throw the whole thing out. A lot of people throw it out. They throw out the baby with the bathwater because they will take something like this and say a God of love could not condemn people, so let's just throw the whole Bible out. I don't believe it. And that's unfortunate, because there's a great deal of wisdom and guidance if we learn how to get it, if we learn how to see it. I think Jesus was a spiritual genius, but I don't think he was the person that he is portrayed, that the only begotten Son of God. I think he would have fled from that idea. There's a section where they says that they tried to make a king out of him, and he fled into a mountain by himself to get away from them. What's interesting is the word Messiah means the anointed. And in the Old Testament, it applied only to kings and priests, that they were anointed, they were Christed. And Jesus did not have New Testament vocabulary. It didn't come along till 40 years after his death. So he thought from the Old Testament perspective. And to try to anoint him as king of the Jews, that's how the Romans characterized him when they crucified him. And that's probably true. They probably did that. But it's a whole different mindset than what we're told now. That the Christ and Messiah are used to mean the same thing today, but not so much in his day. So what I'm saying, this is a very complicated issue. When you're reading Scripture, when you're reading Gospels in particular, you learn to know when the church leaders are speaking and when possibly the Jewish mystic is speaking. And we cannot go through and isolate verses that we would attribute to Jesus and say, here's what Jesus taught. I think it's a lot safer to say this is something that a Jewish mystic would teach. Someone who believes God is within, accessible to all people, that everyone can go in their own inner room and pray to the Father in secret and have results. You don't have to go through the priesthood. You don't have to go through the church. You are the temple of the living God, as Paul said. So that is a mystic speaking. And the principles that they will speak of come from a very different place than the principles of the mainstream Christian message. The mystic is based on principle of oneness. You and I are one with God already. And for that to be true, then we think, well, God, what is the nature of God? Jesus said God is spirit. That can be everywhere present equally at the same time. Omnipresent. God is all power. God is all law, intelligence. And it is centered in every person. God is not an old man up in the sky. And sometimes I think it's a little bit unfortunate that Jesus was raised in a very masculine culture where it's all about men. And the woman was not honored in the way that we may today. We may think of in quite a different way. But there's all these things that creep in as we're reading. So we have to take care that we don't lose these jewels, that we don't overlook them because we're saying, well, that's the church teaching. It's not always. What they did is they had a group of sayings that were passed around orally for 40 years before they began writing them down, although they probably did write down things, though most people were illiterate. About 99% of the people were illiterate. So it was very unusual to have writing. But the people that listened to Jesus apparently understood what he was saying. He was speaking in a way that they could get, unlike their priests. And I think unlike our priests of today, that we're hearing a language that Jesus would not have been familiar with at all, that we're calling the Christian message. The soul is not in need of salvation. We're already whole. We're already complete. created in the image and after the likeness of God. There's parts of the Bible I believe in and parts I don't. I think that writer of Genesis got it. He had the insight to be able to write this down. So I can't really overemphasize that we need to keep in mind there's two messages going on, at least two in the Bible, in the Gospels, the whole Bible actually. There's the core message that Jesus probably taught, and that's in fragments. As I said, it's like a disarticulated skeleton. We've got to pick out this fragment, pick out that fragment, and we don't necessarily put them together as a whole teaching, but we would say, this is something a mystic would say. Whereas the landscape that it's put in, it's the Christian narrative. It was invented by the writers. And Mark actually put it forth first. He told the story about Jesus first. Matthew and Luke came along and used him. They totally plagiarized. It was not illegal back then. But they used nearly all of Mark in their Gospels. And as you go through, if you recognize, and I don't do this, scholars do this, and I depend on their work, their writings to show this. But you'll find they both follow Mark from beginning to end. And then they add their own stuff. And then John comes along and he's completely different. The three, Matthew, Mark, Luke, are called the synoptics because they draw from similar sources. John is something quite different. But it helps to know this stuff, and it's very confusing sometimes to try to sort through it. But once we begin to get the hang of it, I can read a line now and I just ask the question, is that the writer or is that Jesus? And I can usually come up with an answer that at least satisfies me. And we'll never know what Jesus actually said because we have no record around him. There were no biographers walking around. There was nobody with a selfie. You know, we didn't have selfies and all that back then, where people record almost everything that goes on these days. There was nothing like that. So he comes from a very obscure time in history, and there's really nothing written about him personally. And that is kind of an interesting way to think of it. If you think about things like when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, for example, just one example here. He was there alone. What were his disciples doing? They were sleeping. So who would know what he said? Who would know what he was going through in the Garden of Gethsemane? And if you follow the story, you say, well, he probably told somebody about it and they wrote it down and all. Well, that didn't happen that way. Because when you look at the story, there was no time for him to have done that. He didn't have any contact with anybody after that. So how did they know? And when he was in the wilderness, contending with the devil, how would anyone know what was said? If we just ask these simple questions, if somebody wrote a story like that today, we would say, well, how did they know that? Who was there to record it? It's very simple. So you say, well, those stories probably came from tradition, from legend, from myth. But who would have been there to record them? And why didn't all four gospel writers use those? So there's a lot of questions that are raised in that way, and we can get lost in that, and we don't want to do that. But we do want to be able to say, I think this is something the gospel writer, the evangelist, would have written, and this is something Jesus may have said, or the Jewish mystic would have said. So the concept of a day of judgment involving fire and gnashing teeth is a concept based on religious belief rather than spiritual truth. If you go in within yourself in a time of meditation and you have an actual experience, it will be nothing like a day of judgment. It is nothing but absolute light and love and peace and joy. So the religious belief is contrasted with spiritual truth. Spiritual truth does not contain any level of punishment whatsoever. We are punished more by our own thinking, by our own actions, by the world we set up and believe in and try to live in that may not be based on truth. I've seen people that were pretty terrified thinking that they were going to hell. There was a chance they were going to hell. And what I would try to explain to people that had thoughts like that is that doesn't exist. You have picked up an idea that somebody convinced you is true, and it's not. You are not going to be punished for your sins. God is love. Love does not punish. Love will open your eyes to a greater way of seeing. It's like a community that would settle into a valley that floods every year, and a wise man comes along and says, why don't you move your village out of this valley? Go up the mountain a little bit. Live from a higher perspective, and you won't have to deal with that problem. So the person that buys into this thing, that God is a punishing God, God is going to get all of us that are evil, because see, we never know who's who. Because we think we've all made mistakes, and we all have made mistakes. But have you ever made a mistake that's worth burning for eternity in hell for? Some people think they have. And that is unfortunate. And so the healing comes not through a second coming, but through a waking up to what is true at the spiritual level. There is no punishment at the spiritual level. This is what the near-death experiencers say over and over and over again. No matter how bad they have been, they experience this unbelievable, unconditional love in a way they first don't think they deserve, but then they start realizing, well, this is the way it really is. This is how it should be. So all the stuff we learn of a condemning judgment day, a condemning God, it is religious, not spiritual truth. And that's why people say more and more all the time, I'm interested in spirituality, not religion. Totally understandable. And when we're reading the Bible, and I would not discourage anyone from doing that, although many people say it's difficult. And it is. It's because we're trying to read it as one thing when it's not one thing, it's two things. It is the message of the church, early church, and it is probably the message of Jesus. There's always been the hope of people of every era that God would one day intervene in the mess we humans have made. The Essenes envisioned a day when the children of light themselves would one day enter a great battle with the children of darkness, and that's everyone else. And the children of light would prevail. But unfortunately for them, the Roman army permanently upset their plans. The Romans annihilated the Essenes. They kind of called them out at one point, and the Roman army completely annihilated them. So their hope didn't turn out so well. It was all a human perception that this great battle would occur between good and evil, and we're the good ones and they're the bad ones. And that hope exists in a lot of people today. Again, do a search online, you'll see. Ask who's going to go to heaven, ask who's going to go to hell. Just write that question in, and you'll get the traditional answers that you're already familiar with. So I feel very confident in saying that there will be no judgment day as commonly depicted. The quality of every individual's life is determined by their own exercise of judgment. We're held accountable for the way we define reality. We create our own restrictions, and we have the power to erase them. In this sense, every day is Judgment Day. We each decide whether we will be victims or victors of our world. So if you are worried about this great day of judgment, which I don't think many of you are, I hope you're not, we'll get over that and start living your life as you want to live it. All right? So we put that to rest, right? Once and for all. All right. Well, thanks for coming out. Thank you for watching this week's program. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with others. We want to reach as many people as we can, and we appreciate your help. If you'd like to help support this ministry, just click the donate card at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Your financial support means a lot to us. We have many subjects in our video lineup, so feel free to take a look. If there's a topic you don't see and would like me to address, just put it in the comment section. I'd love to know what's on your mind. To subscribe to this channel, simply click our logo. Thanks again for your interest in independent unity, and have a wonderful week.